Joining us now is Marc Short, Advancing American Freedom Board Chair. Marc was also the former White House Legislative Director during the first Trump administration and former Chief of Staff for the Office of Vice President Mike Pence. It's good to have you back, Marc. So,
thanks, sir.
What do you think happens here?
Look, I think we're headed to a shutdown. I think it's frankly to the points that Speaker Johnson just made. I do think Republicans have been there before. I think typically most of the shutdowns in the last few years have been Republicans looking to contain spending. And in some cases, there wasn't really an out, but you're feeling pressure from the base of your party to do something in opposition. And I think that's where Democrats find themselves today. I think it's a little bit hard to explain when Republicans pass resolutions in the House, continuing funding at existing levels, and Democrats actually saying we're going to shut it down because we want $1 trillion in more spending. I think is a hard argument to make, but I think this is less about the policy, and it's really more about the politics of where their party is right now and wanting to show opposition to President Trump.
So how long do you think this lasts?
That's a great question because, again, if there was a policy solution, it'd be a lot easier. But I think that probably the pressure will build on Democrats, that there's a pathway out, in that one of the positions they have is one that Republicans, I think, unfortunately, have signaled they'll accept, which is to extend the Obamacare subsidies. I just think Republicans have wanted to do that at the end of the year. And so I think there's a pathway for Democrats to claim they got that concession from Republicans to schedule that vote. But I think, all Republicans voted against those subsidies when it was part of the COVID legislation. And now it seems there's a large number that actually want it extended.
I wonder what the court of public opinion is going to decide here, because the Democrats are making this about health care. They're making about Medicaid cuts and the big, beautiful bill. They're making about the subsidies, the COVID era health care subsidies, as you just mentioned. At the same time, we're expecting this announcement from President Trump this morning, as our Eamon Javers just reported, on making drug prices lower and getting more access to lower cost drugs for Americans. And I do wonder if that's kind of a strategic play here for getting the high road on this health care issue, as the Democrats try to make the shutdown about it.
Well, I think it's probably viewed by most Americans as a pox on both houses. I do personally think the Democrats are the ones instigating this shutdown because, again, the House has already passed legislation to keep the government open. And I think to support the notion that it's a pox on both houses, Sarah, the irony is that 2 years ago, this same vote came up to extend the government funding at Biden levels. And it was one of the reasons Republicans overthrew Kevin McCarthy as Speaker and replaced him, because they said, we can't do that. And yet here we are 2 years later, and almost every Republican except for Thomas Massie, Rand Paul, are saying, oh, no, we're supportive. And every Democrat 2 years ago who was supportive is now opposed to this continuing resolution at spending levels that Biden had passed. And so I think for a lot of Americans, there'll just be a sense of kind of a pox on both houses.
So what gets it done, and how long does it go on for, Marc?
Well, again, I think that it's one that doesn't have this sort of easy, okay, here's we're going to negotiate on a top level spending. That's usually what drives these sorts of shutdowns. And so I think at some point the Democrats will say, okay, there's been enough bloodletting at this point, and so we need to have a pathway forward. And they'll announce a deal to say we're going to get these Obamacare subsidies extended at the end of the year. Again, I think that's the position Republicans are already giving them, which is why I think this shutdown is more about show. But I suspect this will go on for a few days because they'll need to show the base of their party that they're standing up to Republicans in Congress and to the Trump administration.
Do you think that there will ultimately be any federal layoffs as a result of it, that the Trump administration will use that to continue to cut costs there?
Well, Sarah, I think that certainly Russ Vought has always been a fiscal hawk, and I think he would want that. I think the question is, will President Trump allow him to do that? In the first administration, when there were a lot of cuts proposed, President Trump actually overruled and opposed OMB's cuts that they proposed. I think now the president is in a more revenge scenario against the federal government, so he may want to allow some of those to move forward. But ultimately, I think that's going to be a decision internally to the White House whether Trump allows OMB to continue with those.
All right, Marc, thanks for the perspective. It's always good to hear from you. Marc Short.
Thanks for having me.